Welcome back once again to the course Life of Christ. We're now in class 45, although now we've done about 70 videos. And after all of that, we've covered the bulk of Jesus' ministry. We've covered his miracles. We've covered a lot of his teaching. And now we've arrived at the last week of his life, what's called Passion Week by some, or Holy Week by others, Easter Week by some. And we're going to start with the triumphal entry on the Sunday of that week. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the events of this week, both from the text and also in maps and graphics and in pictures. So I hope this is all helpful to you as we work through it. Let me invite you then to go with me to Matthew chapter 21. And I want to suggest that this picture is how I think maybe Jesus looked at this last week of his life as he was doing his ministry and as he thought about what was going to happen in Jerusalem, as he planned to go toward Jerusalem, as he set out on that last final journey, and he told his disciples over and over, this is what's going to happen when I get to Jerusalem. And what we have here is a picture taken from the Mount of Olives over toward the Temple Mount, and where you see the Golden Dome, the Dome of the Rock, or the Mosque of Omar. It's a Muslim mosque. That is about where the temple used to sit in Jesus' time. And so you can just imagine Jesus being on the Mount of Olives that last week and looking across to the place where he would be in the temple several times, where eventually he would go into his trial. And then just a little bit further on, over here in the middle of the picture, this gray dome you can barely see would be marking the place of Calvary, where he died. And in the foreground, you see a bush with these long, really sharp thorns. You can't even get near these without getting poked and bleeding. And they think that perhaps this is the kind of a bush that they used from which they took the crown of thorns. And so you can just imagine, as he thought about this week, framed by suffering, by difficult times, by confrontations and conflict, disappointment from his disciples and from the people who followed, then left, then finally turned on him. I think that probably he looked at this week as a week framed by suffering in every way. So let's look from Matthew's point of view, Matthew 21, reading the first 11 verses. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with their colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowd that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Now let's talk some about this story. You know the story itself, basically. We may not be aware of everything that's behind the story and what the people may have been understanding and thinking would happen as the week went on. As you look at this picture, what you have is an aerial shot of the Mount of Olives, and behind it then the Temple Mount. Let me kind of show you some of this. This story starts out at the beginning saying they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. Okay, so if you look at this picture, starting right here with this kind of open area, you see some tombs. It's a cemetery, famous cemetery. This is the southern end of the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives actually is a series of little peaks. It's not very high at all, just a little bit above the city of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives runs from down here in the south up through to the north up here. Okay? And so Bethphage, that's mentioned here, is right here. It's on the eastern side of the city, really kind of over the Mount of Olives. If you're starting in Jerusalem, you have to go over it to get to Bethphage. And then Bethany, where Jesus was on Saturday night, in John 12, when Mary anointed Jesus there, Bethany's right here. And of course, that's where Lazarus was also raised from the dead. And it's likely that Jesus stayed with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus during this last week, at least some of the time. He may have spent some nights there, and then maybe other nights on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, where we'll see later. All right. Now, if you zoom on down, now you're standing on top of the Mount of Olives, and you're looking down in front of you. Right in front of you here is part of that Jewish cemetery that I mentioned to you. Then down here at the bottom, this is the Kidron Valley that's mentioned in the Bible, especially in John. Then as you go up the slopes toward the temple and the Temple Mount, you have another cemetery right here, right before you get to the wall, and then the city wall. And this is actually a Muslim cemetery, okay? And then right over here, you can't see it very well. We'll see it better later. This is the Eastern Gate. That's one of the strong possibilities for where Jesus entered Jerusalem in the triumphal entry. And that would lead you straight onto the Temple Mount right back here. And as we said, the temple would have been either right about where the Golden Dome is, or maybe a little bit to the north or so, but right around this area. We know we're within 100 meters of where the temple used to be. Okay, then you see the rest of modern Jerusalem back in the background and the old city all around it. Then if you start from the top of the Mount of Olives, then you can take this road down, and it's called the Palm Sunday Road, based on this story here. Based on these events, this is where the crowd accompanied Jesus, and Jesus rode on the donkey with the cloaks and the palm branches and people shouting. And it's a pretty steep slope down from the top of the Mount of Olives, heading toward, then over here you see, just barely see the Mosque of Omar with the Golden Dome, the Eastern Gate right here. And this is me with two of my friends over here going down the Palm Sunday Road. Now, when it's Easter week, and it's actually Palm Sunday morning, then they recreate this every year, especially the Christians, believers that come, and it looks more like this. And so now you see clearly more of the road. You see the Golden Dome in the background and the wall and everything, and the Eastern Gate. But now you see all the people with their palm branches and everything, and they walk this same path that Jesus would have taken with his disciples. Okay, so that's maybe more like what it would have been at those times. Obviously, I don't think these walls were there, but this is about the same path that they took. And then we have some of the background here. I want to go now to Psalm 118, if you want to follow along with me. It'll help you understand some of the background. Psalm 118, beginning in verse 19, although the whole psalm is interesting to read for context. But I want you to notice the words of this psalm and how they overlap with many of the things that are happening on this triumphal entry. Okay? One of the things that you need to know is that during this Passover week, there was a certain liturgy, a certain set of songs that they would sing in the celebrations. And this is just as if we had Christmas season, and there's certain Christmas songs we sing during that season. Well, during Passover week, the Psalms especially that would be used are Psalms 113 through 118. And so this is one of the Psalms that would have been sung and recited during this week, maybe a number of times, like we sing Christmas songs numerous times during the season. And so perhaps the people that are celebrating Passover are just singing one of the Passover songs, and they may not be connecting what they're singing with what's actually happening right literally in front of them. And so that's interesting. But notice the similarities of the passage we read in Matthew 21 and this passage here, because actually Matthew 21 fulfills part of Psalm 118. Okay, verse 19, open for me the gates of the righteous. I will enter and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord through which the righteous may enter. I will give you thanks, for you answered me. You have become my salvation. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The Lord has done it this very day. Let us rejoice today and be glad. Lord, save us. Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord we bless you. The Lord is God, and he has made his light shine on us. With boughs in hand, join in the festal procession up to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will praise you. You are my God, and I will exalt you. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Okay, now did you notice all the references there, all the overlaps? I mean, you can just go back and really look at many parts of it. Open for me the gates of the righteous. Here we're going into the gates of Jerusalem there. I will enter and give thanks to the Lord, and they're giving thanks, but they don't realize that the Lord is actually sitting right among them there. The righteous enter through this gate, and Jesus is about to go through this gate as the righteous one. And then one of the ones that I like is, you have become my salvation. Remember, we talked in the story of Zacchaeus about that the Hebrew name for Jesus is Yeshua, and that is the same root as salvation. And so it says, you have become my Yeshua, you have become my Jesus, my salvation. So their salvation is riding the donkey right in the middle of them. Okay. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, a famous messianic prophecy that actually Jesus cites later on in this same chapter about himself. Okay. And then ironically, verse 24, the Lord has done it this very day. Let us rejoice today and be glad. Other versions say, this is the day the Lord has made. I'll rejoice and be glad in it. But it's interesting, the Lord has done it this very day, and here is Jesus this very day, and they're rejoicing, but they don't quite understand it all. Okay, and then you have in verse 25, Lord save us, and that is Hosanna, Lord grant us success. Okay, and so again, you see the overlap there. And then from the house of the Lord we bless you. We know that Jesus ended up in the temple. The Lord is God. He has made his light shine on us. Jesus, the light of the world, is right there in their midst with boughs in hand. And there they have their palm branches there. They go up to the altar. I mean, it just fits all the way through the passage. Okay. Now, originally, this psalm may have been written after a great victory for David and the nation. And it was written to welcome David and perhaps the army back into town as he went up to Jerusalem again. Or other people think that maybe this psalm is more in the context of the return of the Jewish people from exile in Babylonia when they come finally back to Jerusalem and to the temple. That could also be. But no matter which of those contexts it is, or maybe it was used for both, in some ways this psalm finds its fullest fulfillment at this day with Jesus. Now, there's another quote here that comes from the Old Testament also, that comes from Matthew 1, citing the Old Testament, and that is in Zechariah chapter 9. Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 through 11. And listen again to the connection here, not only to this story, but also to future events. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so that was the part that was fulfilled in what they saw. But then listen to the rest of it too. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. And you wonder if perhaps the Jews in the crowd thought about the context of the citation about the donkey, and then thought, okay, so then it says there will be a time of peace, and Jesus is coming as the Prince of Peace. Ephesians 2, he himself is our peace, who has taken the Jews and the Gentiles and made them one. His rule extends from sea to sea, talks about the blood of his covenant, and we know that's coming there on Friday later this week. And so you wonder if the Jews heard this one piece as a kind of a remez, a hint, and remembered the rest of the context and thought, okay, he's coming into the city now, but could it be that this week then he'll fulfill the rest of this context, that there will be a new covenant, that there will be peace? Could this Messiah be bringing peace to Jerusalem? And maybe some of the Jews thought about it that way, but not peace in a spiritual sense, peace with God, but peace, finally getting rid of the Romans. They were hoping that Jesus would be the earthly Messiah, fighting an earthly war, establishing an earthly reign, and having earthly power. And so some of the more zealous Jews, or the zealots themselves, perhaps were the ones with the palm branches, because is it not only a celebration, it's not only mentioned really in this Psalm 118, but the palm branches were also a symbol of national pride. It was part of what you saw in some of the coins that were printed, that you saw a palm branch as a symbol of Israel. And so if the Romans look out from the walls of Jerusalem and they see this huge crowd coming down and saying, "Lord, save us," and they see palm branches, they could see that actually as a political demonstration. And they might start to get worried, and they might start to wonder if they need to mobilize and get outside with the soldiers and put down this rebellion. Now, they don't do that, but that's one of the possible meanings that this could have had as the people accompanied Jesus into Jerusalem, okay? And so, again, many interesting things about the text. That's the background for this, Zechariah and Psalms, the actual cultural context with the Romans and the Jews, and then the mission of Jesus in the middle of all that. And so they continue to go on down, and they get to the next part of the Palm Sunday road, and Jesus stops. And let's read the story just briefly from Luke and also from Matthew, because what these two passages are is actually a combination of two times when Jesus wept or mourned for Jerusalem during this last week. Luke 19 is right now on the triumphal entry when they're going down the mountain. And Matthew 23 is actually a little bit later, maybe Tuesday or Wednesday of the week. But again, it's a time when he's mourning for the city. So we're going to take those together. First of all, Luke 19, 41 through 44. And it says, "As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, 'If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace,'" really what these passages are talking about, "but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." And so he stops and he weeps in the middle of this celebration. It's just about the best way to ruin a celebration when the hero stops and cries. And they must be thinking, "Why are you upset? Why are you crying? This is a moment of great triumph. We're about to crown you as our earthly king. Why are you crying?" And he's crying because they completely miss what his purpose is. If you'd only recognize that, but they don't. So let's jump over then to Matthew 23 and go to the end of that chapter in verses 37 through 39. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And so there's this time of weeping, and it happens about this place here. If you come on down the Palm Sunday road, you come about halfway down the Mount of Olives, and you look to your right, and you see this gateway into a certain part of a garden on the Mount of Olives. And there's always people there trying to sell stuff too. Now, if you go through this gate, and you walk down this sidewalk here, okay, then on your right, you come to this church here. And this church is called the Dominus Flevit, which means from Latin, the Lord wept. And if you notice, the architect made the church in the shape of a teardrop, okay, to symbolize the sorrow, the weeping of the Lord. And then also you have here on the corners right here that look like small, thin, skinny vases almost. On each corner, there's one on the back corner as well that we don't see. And what those are, as I understand it, lacrimaries, which is kind of a jar. It's a bigger version of a small jar they used to make that they would make to hold the tears of a person during their life, especially toward the end of their lives as they were sorrowing about dying. And they would collect the tears from all their sorrows in this little jar. And then, as I understand it, then they would put the jar on the chest of the person as they laid in their casket before they were buried. And the idea was that they would take all their sorrows of their life, and when they woke up then in heaven, then they could give the Lord their jar with all their sorrows, and he would wipe every tear from their eyes, kind of like it says in Revelation. And so the whole idea here is that this is a place where the Lord wept, and yet God would take the sorrows away eventually. Okay. Now, this is a beautiful church, really simple. And if you go kind of in front of the church, this is the view that you have of the Kidron Valley down below. And then you have the Muslim cemetery here, the Eastern Gate, and then the Temple Mount with Golden Dome there in the background. What I want to do is jump over to another one of our 360 videos, if I can, really quickly here. Let me get it ready. Okay. That actually may be. Okay. Okay, so you see now, we're standing just in front of the church, just about. And you see in the background then the Golden Dome, okay? And so if we start to rotate it, we look on north, down the Kidron Valleys right here, going north. We see another church over here called the Church of Mary Magdalene with the golden onion domes, kind of a Russian Orthodox church. And we see part of the cemetery here. Then we come on over to the kind of the terrace or the patio in front of this church, and we see the church there. Okay, so you see the lacrimaries on the corners. You see this big window, and we'll talk about this window in just a minute and see that. And you see my friend Brent there explaining things. And then as you look south, then you see the city of David right down here, the original Jerusalem, and then come back around to the Temple Mount. Okay. So let's jump back over to our PowerPoint. Now, if you turn around then and go inside the church, then one thing that the priest had us do the first time we ever went, he put us right in the center of that church inside, and he had us look out through this amazing window. And right in front of us, maybe about 5 or 6 feet away, was an altar. And on the altar was this crucifix of Jesus on the cross. And then as you look on behind it, it's almost as if in this picture, Jesus is stretching out his arms to gather the city in under his arm, as a hen gathers her chicks under its wings. Okay. And then in the background, you see the Golden Dome, and then you see the gray dome over here that marks the site of what they think was Calvary. So the first time that we stood there, the priest centered us there right in front of the window and said, "What do you see?" And we said, "Well, we see the old city and the Golden Dome and, you know, the gray dome in the back of Calvary." And he said, "Well, really, what you're looking at here between where you're standing and where Jesus was crucified back here, there's hundreds of tombs from the Muslims, from the Jews, from everybody, from centuries," says, "but only one of those tombs is empty." I thought that's a pretty cool way to remind us about Jesus' resurrection there in the middle of this sadness of his crying and of his suffering on the cross. And so if you look down underneath that altar, on the front of that altar, then they have this kind of a seal that in Latin has the passage that we read from Matthew 23, "How often I wish to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not." And so the combination of that passage, the image of the hen, the protection, the love there, the crucifix, then Jerusalem in the background, it's a powerful combination there. And then again, you see very well the context there of the gray domes in the background where Calvary is. Okay. Now, so suppose then you're still going down the Palm Sunday Road. So you turn and you start to cross the Kidron Valley right down here at the bottom. Okay. Then you start to go up toward the old city, and you have the Eastern Gate right here. You see kind of a double gate. This is actually probably above where it was in the time of Jesus. So you get a little bit closer, a little bit sharper there. You see they've closed it up, which is actually prophesied in the Bible that this gate would be closed up. And this, again, is still probably above where Jesus was. The other one was probably, maybe 3 or 4 meters lower. And then as you go through the gates, if you could, and turn around, you look backwards toward the eastern gates from the inside, then you see the Mount of Olives in the background. And this is where we came down right here. Then you turn back around again toward the Temple Mount, and you see part of the Temple Mount. Over to your left, where you can't see, would be the Golden Dome. And then some people think that if the Temple, Holy of Holies, was not under the Golden Dome, that maybe this little gazebo kind of thing marks where the Holy of Holies might have been, just a little bit north of the Golden Dome. Other people suggest that perhaps this rock here is where Abraham might have come to offer Isaac on Mount Moriah back in Genesis 22. Now, there's really no way to know that for sure. We can't say it. But again, you have this sense of being right there where Jesus would have been, and it really brings the stories more to life. And we know for a fact that some of these stones, for example, right here, and over to the left especially, we know they're from the same Temple Mount platform from the time of Jesus. And so we know we're walking across the same stones where Jesus and the apostles and all the devout Jews walked during their celebrations near the temple. So that's pretty cool too as well. All right. So you have all of that. And then you have in Mark 11, it says that Jesus goes to the temple and then returns to Bethany for the night. In Matthew's version, it says that he returns to Bethany after the fig tree incident and the purification. But we have the same basic events. He goes, down the Palm Sunday road. He goes into the temple. He's in the temple for a while, and then he returns back out of the city. And there's one more note as we finish up this part, and that is that the name Bethany actually means house of the poor or house of suffering. And so if he stayed there some of the nights of this week, then in a sense, what his mission was overall is what he does this week. He goes from God's house, the temple, back to Bethany, the house of the poor, or other words, from heaven to earth and then back again. And again, it's maybe a summary of what his mission was on the earth. So a final thought to leave you with. Looking forward to talking about the rest of the events in this last week of Jesus. We'll see you next time.